From the outside, our marriage seemed unshakable. Vanessa and I were the kind of couple that inspired envy. At least that's what people told us. She was elegant, confident, and social, the kind of woman who turned heads wherever she went. I was quieter, content to let her shine while I stayed in the background. We complemented each other, or so I thought. Vanessa believed I worked as a mid-level manager at a local logistics company, and I let her think that. It wasn't exactly a lie. I did oversee some operations, but those operations happened to be part of a multi-million-dollar conglomerate I built from the ground up. I didn't flaunt my wealth because I wanted genuine connections, not relationships built on dollar signs. Vanessa had been a part of my life for years, and I had assumed that what we had was real. But cracks had begun to form in the foundation of our marriage, subtle at first, but undeniable. It started small. Vanessa began dropping hints about wanting more out of life. Bigger vacations, a nicer car, a house in an upscale neighborhood. She spoke with a casual wistfulness, but I could feel the underlying discontent. "I just don't want us to feel stuck," she said one evening as we ate dinner. "We're not stuck," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "We have everything we need, don't we?" She smiled faintly, but her eyes told a different story. "I guess so." Over time, her dissatisfaction became harder to ignore. She started spending more time with her friends, many of whom were married to men who flaunted their wealth. Lavish birthday parties, designer handbags, luxury cars. They were part of the world Vanessa wanted to be a part of, a world she thought I couldn't give her. Her jealousy wasn't loud or confrontational. It was quiet, simmering just beneath the surface. She would make offhand comments about her friends' husbands and their grand gestures, always careful not to sound too critical. "Did you see the trip Julia's husband planned for their anniversary?" she said one night as we watched TV. "I did," I replied, not looking away from the screen. "It looked nice." "Nice," she scoffed. "It was breathtaking. They went to Bora Bora. It's the kind of trip you remember for the rest of your life." I didn't respond. What could I say? Things took a turn when she met Oliver. He was her new boss, a man who wore his wealth on his sleeve. Flashy watches, tailored suits, expensive cars. Oliver was everything Vanessa thought she wanted in a partner. At first, I didn't think much of it. Vanessa would mention him in passing, talking about how charismatic and driven he was. But over time, her mentions of Oliver became more frequent, and her tone changed. "He's just so inspiring," she said one evening as we sat on the patio. "He built his company from nothing, you know? It's incredible." I nodded, sipping my coffee. "Sounds like a hard worker." "He is," she said, her eyes lighting up. "He's the kind of person who doesn't settle. He always goes for more." The unspoken comparison hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that her admiration for Oliver was professional, not personal. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. Vanessa was pulling away, and I didn't know how to stop it. The illusion of our perfect marriage was starting to crack, and I could feel the ground beneath me begin to shift. But what Vanessa didn't know, what none of her friends knew, was that I wasn't the man she thought I was. I wasn't a struggling manager trying to make ends meet. I was a billionaire who had chosen to live modestly because I believed love was more important than wealth. And if Vanessa wanted to test that belief, she was about to find out exactly what kind of man I truly was. I started noticing the changes in Vanessa long before she realized I was watching. She'd become more secretive, her phone constantly glued to her hand. The late-night texts she claimed were work-related, the sudden interest in staying out late for team dinners, and the new wardrobe that seemed to scream for attention. It all painted a picture I didn't want to see. I wanted to believe in the woman I married, the woman who once said she loved me for my simplicity, my steadiness. But simplicity wasn't what Vanessa wanted anymore. She wanted extravagance, flash, and status, the things she thought I couldn't give her. The cracks in our marriage became chasms the day of her party. Vanessa had been planning the event for weeks. She'd invited her closest friends, people who thrived on gossip and appearances. And of course, Oliver would be there. "Why don't you invite some of your friends?" she said casually one evening as she arranged the seating chart. "I don't think they'd fit in with your crowd," I replied, my tone deliberately neutral. She didn't argue. Vanessa was smart enough to know I wasn't wrong. The night of the party, I watched from the sidelines as Vanessa played hostess. She floated from guest to guest, her laugh a little too loud, her touches a little too familiar. When Oliver arrived, her demeanor shifted completely. I had met Oliver once before, at a company function. He was everything Vanessa admired: confident, wealthy, and unapologetically arrogant. That night, he walked into our home like he owned it, his arm brushing against Vanessa's shoulder as she greeted him with a dazzling smile. "Good to see you again, Nathan," Oliver said, extending a hand. "You too," I replied, gripping his hand a little tighter than necessary. The moment was brief, but his smirk lingered. He knew exactly what he was doing, and so did Vanessa. I spent most of the evening watching the interactions between Vanessa and Oliver. The way she leaned in when he spoke, the way his hand rested on her lower back as they laughed about something I wasn't privy to. It was all painfully deliberate. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. The breaking point came when I overheard Vanessa talking to her friends in the kitchen. "I just feel like I'm stuck," she said, her voice dripping with frustration. "Stuck?" Sophie replied, her tone concerned. "With Nathan," Vanessa continued. "He's a good guy, but he doesn't have ambition. Oliver, though, he understands me. He makes me feel alive." Her words cut deeper than I expected. I had always known Vanessa wanted more, but to hear her speak about me like I was a burden, a placeholder, was something else entirely. I stepped into the room, my presence immediately silencing their conversation. "Everything okay?" I asked, my tone calm but pointed. Vanessa froze, her eyes widening slightly before she quickly recovered. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. I nodded, glancing at Sophie, whose discomfort was palpable. "Good. I just wanted to check." I left the room, but the damage had already been done. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, I confronted Vanessa. "What was that about?" I asked, leaning against the doorway as she tidied up. "What was what about?" she replied, feigning innocence. "You know what I mean," I said, my voice steady. "You, Sophie, and your little confession about being stuck." Her eyes narrowed, and the mask dropped. "If you were listening, you already know how I feel, Nathan." Her defiance was startling, but I didn't let it shake me. "Do you?" I asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like you're more interested in Oliver than your husband." Vanessa laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Maybe I am," she said. "At least he understands what it means to live." Her words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past her and up the stairs, leaving her to clean up the mess she had created, not just in the kitchen, but in our marriage. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room, I realized something. Vanessa wasn't just testing the limits of our relationship. She was breaking them. And while she thought I was just another stuck man in her life, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Because I wasn't stuck. I was just waiting. I knew the party wasn't just a celebration. It was a stage for Vanessa, a chance to flaunt her charm, her status, and, most importantly, her connection to Oliver. She thought I'd stand quietly in the corner, playing the role of the clueless husband, while she basked in the glow of her new circle. What Vanessa didn't realize was that I was watching every move, every glance, every laugh that lingered too long. I wasn't the fool she believed me to be, and her performance wasn't going unnoticed. The night started predictably enough. Guests poured into the house, the sound of laughter and music quickly filling the space. Vanessa was in her element, her smile radiant as she greeted everyone. She looked stunning in a sleek black dress, her confidence radiating in every step. I stayed in the background, mingling with a few guests, but mostly observing. Oliver arrived fashionably late, of course, his entrance deliberate and commanding. He strode into the room with the ease of a man who thought the world was his for the taking. Vanessa's eyes lit up when she saw him, and she practically floated across the room to greet him. I watched as they embraced, her hand lingering on his shoulder just a little too long. "Good to see you, Vanessa," Oliver said, his voice smooth and dripping with charm. "You too," she replied, her smile practically glowing. I clenched my jaw but said nothing. As the night went on, I noticed Vanessa becoming bolder. She laughed louder at Oliver's jokes, leaned in closer when he spoke, and seemed to forget I was even in the room. Her friends encouraged her, their whispered comments and knowing glances adding fuel to the fire. At one point, I walked past a group of them huddled near the bar. "He's so perfect for her," one of her friends said, her voice low but not low enough. "Unlike Nathan," another added with a smirk. I stopped for a moment, letting their words sink in, but instead of confronting them, I simply walked away. They weren't worth my anger. The moment of public humiliation came later in the evening. Vanessa, clearly emboldened by the drinks and the attention, decided it was time to make a spectacle. I was standing near the patio door, speaking with one of the guests, when she approached me with Oliver by her side. "Nathan," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the nearby crowd. "Why don't you join the conversation? Or are you too busy standing in the shadows as usual?" Her tone was mocking, her smile cold. The guests around us chuckled, their laughter feeding her arrogance. I turned to her, keeping my expression calm. "I'm just observing, Vanessa. You seem to be doing enough talking for both of us." Her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Maybe if you knew how to be interesting, I wouldn't have to," she shot back. The crowd laughed again, and Oliver smirked, clearly enjoying the show. And then it happened. Vanessa stepped closer, grabbing the collar of my shirt. "You know," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, "this shirt perfectly sums you up. Plain, boring, and outdated." With one swift motion, she tore it, the fabric ripping loudly as the crowd gasped. For a moment, there was silence. Everyone stared at me, waiting for my reaction. Vanessa stood there, triumphant, her hands still clutching the torn fabric. I looked down at my shirt, then back at her, my expression unreadable. Slowly, I smiled, a calm, knowing smile that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. "Interesting," I said quietly, stepping closer to her. "You just showed everyone here exactly who you are." Her smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. "I think we're done here," I added, turning and walking away. As I left the room, I heard whispers ripple through the crowd. The laughter was gone, replaced by unease. Vanessa had won her moment of humiliation, but she didn't realize she'd just set the stage for her own downfall. That night, as I closed the door to my study, I knew the time had come. She thought she could tear me down, reduce me to nothing in front of her lover and her friends. But Vanessa had no idea who she was dealing with. After Vanessa's public stunt, the house felt different. It wasn't just the physical reminder of my torn shirt or the echoes of laughter from her friends. It was the shift in energy. Vanessa had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to ignore it. But I also wasn't going to explode or confront her with the anger she probably expected. That wasn't my style. I had always believed that power wasn't about who could shout the loudest or act the quickest. It was about who could act the smartest. And I had all the time in the world. The morning after the party, Vanessa was her usual self, at least on the surface. She moved through the kitchen humming to herself, her phone buzzing every few minutes with text from Sophie or one of her other enablers. I sat at the dining table, sipping my coffee and watching her. She didn't even glance at me, as though I were invisible. But that was fine. I didn't need her attention right now. "Busy morning?" I asked casually, breaking the silence. She looked up, clearly startled by my tone. "I hadn't spoken much since the party. Just catching up with the girls," she said with a shrug. "Good," I replied, smiling faintly. "You'll need them." Her brow furrowed, but I didn't elaborate. Instead, I stood, placed my mug in the sink, and left for the office. At work, I called Maxwell, my assistant and the only person who truly understood the scope of my wealth and influence. "I need a few things," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Of course," Maxwell replied. "What's the situation?" I outlined my plan, piece by piece, while Maxwell listened attentively. He didn't question my motives or my methods. He simply nodded and said, "Consider it done." Step 1 was information. Vanessa thought she had control of the narrative, but she didn't realize how much I already knew, and how much more I was about to uncover. Maxwell had connections everywhere, from private investigators to discreet tech experts. By the end of the week, I would know everything about Oliver, Vanessa, and even the so-called friends who had laughed at me. That evening, Vanessa was waiting for me when I got home. She was dressed impeccably, as if trying to recreate the image of the perfect wife. She smiled brightly, but I could see the tension in her eyes. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone overly sweet. "Productive," I said simply, brushing past her. She followed me into the living room, clearly fishing for more. "I was thinking we could go out for dinner this weekend, just the two of us." I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "You want to have dinner? With me?" Her smile faltered. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" I let the silence stretch between us before replying. "I'll think about it." Over the next few days, Maxwell kept me updated. Oliver's business dealings were as shady as I suspected. He had a history of using his charm to manipulate clients and employees, and there were whispers of illegal activity that could ruin him if brought to light. Vanessa's financial habits were equally enlightening. She had been siphoning money from our joint account to fund her new lifestyle, dinners, clothes, even gifts for Oliver. As for her friends, they weren't as loyal as she believed. Maxwell uncovered messages between Sophie and another friend, mocking Vanessa's obsession with Oliver and her desperate attempt to marry up. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed, but I wasn't ready to act just yet. Timing was everything, and I wanted Vanessa to feel the weight of her choices before I made my move. That Friday, I joined her for dinner, just as she'd suggested. She seemed surprised but pleased, using the opportunity to talk about mundane things as though nothing had happened. But as she laughed and sipped her wine, I saw her for who she truly was, a woman who had underestimated the man sitting across from her. She thought she had one. She thought she was in control. She couldn't have been more wrong. That night, as I watched her fall asleep, I felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were falling into place, and the stage was set. Vanessa had torn my shirt in front of her lover and her friends, laughing as though I were nothing. But soon, she would realize just how much power I truly held, and how far I was willing to go to remind her of it. Because I wasn't just her husband. I was Nathan, self-made, deliberate, and about to turn her entire world upside down. The aftermath of the party lingered in the air for days. Vanessa acted as though nothing had happened, as though tearing my shirt and humiliating me in front of her friends and Oliver was a minor blip. She carried on with her usual routines, her arrogance untamed, and her phone constantly buzzing with messages from Sophie and the others. But I wasn't passive. I wasn't going to play the role she'd assigned me, the quiet, defeated husband. No, I was waiting, watching, and preparing. And fate decided to hand me the perfect opportunity to set the stage for her downfall. Vanessa's circle thrived on appearances and extravagance. A week after the initial party, Sophie suggested another gathering, this time at Oliver's sprawling penthouse. Vanessa jumped at the chance to flaunt her connection to him further. "You should come," Vanessa said one evening, her tone casual as she leaned against the kitchen counter. I looked up from my book, raising an eyebrow. "You want me there?" "It wouldn't hurt," she replied, shrugging. "You've been so distant lately. Maybe this would help you loosen up." Her words dripped with condescension, but I smiled faintly. "I'll think about it." Of course, I already knew I was going. I wouldn't miss this for the world. The night of the party, Vanessa dressed to impress. Her shimmering silver dress hugged her figure perfectly, and her makeup was flawless. She glanced at me as I adjusted my tie in the mirror, a hint of surprise flashing across her face. "You're coming after all?" she asked, unable to hide her skepticism. "Why not?" I replied, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "It'll be nice to see your friends again." She didn't respond, but the way she shifted uncomfortably told me she wasn't sure how to feel about my decision. Oliver's penthouse was everything Vanessa dreamed of. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, expensive art on the walls, and a bar stocked with the finest liquor. She lit up the moment we walked in, immediately gravitating toward Oliver. I stayed in the background, greeting a few familiar faces but mostly observing. The atmosphere was lively, the laughter loud, and the drinks flowing freely. It didn't take long for things to start unraveling. About an hour into the party, one of the guests, a young woman I didn't recognize, collapsed near the bar. The laughter and music came to an abrupt halt as people rushed to her side, panicked and unsure of what to do. "She's not breathing," someone shouted. Oliver stepped forward, his confidence momentarily faltering. "Everyone stay calm. Someone call 911. I moved closer, kneeling beside the woman and checking her pulse. It was faint, but it was there. My years of first aid training kicked in as I instructed the nearby guests on what to do until paramedics arrived. As I worked to stabilize her, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a small baggie near the bar, partially hidden under a napkin. I didn't touch it, but I saw enough to know what it was. Oliver's confidence shattered completely when the paramedics arrived. They quickly assessed the situation and began asking questions about what had happened. "She just collapsed," one guest stammered. "We were drinking and then she took something," I interjected, my tone calm but pointed. "You might want to check near the bar." The paramedics exchanged glances before retrieving the baggie. Oliver's face turned pale as they held it up, the evidence damning. Vanessa's arrogance crumbled in real time as she realized the severity of the situation. Her friends, once so lively and carefree, now looked terrified. The paramedics didn't stop with the woman on the floor. They began questioning the guests, and it quickly became clear that Oliver had been distributing more than just drinks at his parties. Vanessa turned to me, her eyes wide with panic. "Nathan, You wanted me to come," I said, my voice low. "So here I am, watching everything unfold." By the time the police arrived, the party was in shambles. Guests were being questioned, and Oliver was cornered, his charm and confidence useless against the hard reality of law enforcement. Vanessa stood frozen in the middle of it all, her perfect image shattered. As I watched the chaos, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the end game, far from it, but it was a step. Vanessa had wanted to humiliate me in front of her lover and her friends. Now, she was standing in the wreckage of her own creation, and the real reckoning was only just beginning. Because I wasn't done yet. The moment the paramedics arrived, the air in Oliver's penthouse shifted from chaos to fear. The once lively party had devolved into a scene of panic, shame, and silence. The young woman who had collapsed lay on the floor, her shallow breathing the only sound in a room that had been filled with laughter minutes earlier. I stood back, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. Vanessa hovered near the bar, her face pale, clutching her drink like it was the only thing anchoring her. Oliver, usually the picture of confidence, looked like a man scrambling for excuses. His charm and swagger were gone, replaced by a nervous energy that betrayed his guilt. The paramedics worked quickly, checking the woman's vitals and stabilizing her condition. One of them, a tall man with a calm demeanor, scanned the room. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "She just collapsed," Sophie stammered, her usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. I stepped forward, my voice steady. "It might have something to do with what she took," I said, nodding toward the small baggie of pills one of the paramedics had already noticed near the bar. The paramedic picked up the baggie, his expression grim. "This isn't just alcohol," he muttered, showing it to his partner. Oliver's face turned ashen. I don't know where that came from," he stammered, his hands raised defensively. "Really?" I said, my tone laced with sarcasm. "Because it seems pretty convenient that something like this would show up at your party." The tension in the room grew thicker as everyone stared at Oliver. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. The police arrived shortly after, their presence adding another layer of unease to the already fractured atmosphere. They spoke with the paramedics first, then began questioning the guests. Vanessa, who had been trying to blend into the background, was suddenly in the spotlight. One of the officers approached her, his notebook in hand. "Ma'am, were you aware of any substances being distributed at this party?" Her eyes darted to me, then to Oliver, before she shook her head. "No, I wasn't. I had no idea." The officer nodded, jotting down her response. I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't the glamorous evening she had envisioned. This was a disaster. Oliver wasn't as composed. When the officers turned their attention to him, he stumbled over his words, trying to deflect blame. "I don't know how that got here," he insisted, gesturing toward the baggie. "I didn't bring it." "But you hosted the party," the officer replied, his tone neutral but firm. "And you're responsible for what happens here." Oliver's confidence crumbled further with each question. His smooth demeanor couldn't save him now. As the police continued their investigation, I noticed Vanessa inching closer to me. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a look of desperation. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what's going to happen?" I turned to her, my expression calm. "That depends," I said quietly, "on how honest everyone is willing to be." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she closed them quickly, realizing there was nothing she could say to change the situation. By the end of the night, the police had detained Oliver for further questioning. The young woman who had collapsed was taken to the hospital, and most of the guests left in a hurry, their laughter replaced by whispers and shaken nerves. Vanessa stood in the middle of the room, staring at the empty space where Oliver had been. Her friends avoided her, their loyalty evaporating the moment trouble arrived. I walked past her, pausing briefly to speak. "It's funny," I said, my voice low. "You wanted me to come tonight to see what I was missing. Turns out, I'm not the one who missed anything." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, but I didn't wait for her response. That night, as I drove home, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Vanessa had spent weeks trying to undermine me, to humiliate me, to prove that she had the upper hand. But in the end, all she had managed to do was expose the emptiness of the life she was chasing. The game wasn't over, but the tide was turning, and Vanessa was finally beginning to understand what it felt like to lose. The house was eerily silent the morning after the disaster at Oliver's party. Vanessa moved around the kitchen in slow, deliberate movements, as if hoping I wouldn't notice her. She sipped her coffee quietly, her gaze fixed on the window, avoiding me at all costs. I could feel the tension rolling off her in waves, but I wasn't about to make it easy for her. I waited until she set her mug down and started flipping through her phone, no doubt hoping for some sign that her circle of friends wasn't entirely crumbling around her. Then I spoke, my voice calm but pointed. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "what's your plan now?" Vanessa froze mid-scroll, her eyes darting toward me. "Plan for what?" she asked, feigning ignorance. "For the mess you've created," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "You spent weeks chasing Oliver, building up this fantasy life, and now it's all falling apart. So, what's your next move?" Her face turned pale, but she quickly masked it with a defensive glare. "I didn't create that mess, Nathan. I had no idea what was going on at the party." I raised an eyebrow, letting her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "You didn't know?" I asked, my tone incredulous. "You've been attached to Oliver's hip for weeks, hanging on his every word, and now you want me to believe you didn't know anything about what he was doing?" "I didn't," she snapped, her voice rising. "How could I? I wasn't the one handing out pills. But you were the one standing beside him, basking in his glow, pretending to be part of something bigger than yourself," I said coldly. "You wanted the spotlight, Vanessa. Well, now you've got it." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let them sway me. I wasn't angry. I was beyond anger. I was resolute. "What's worse," I continued, "is that you didn't just betray me. You betrayed yourself. You let your greed and your insecurity drive you into his arms, thinking he could give you what I couldn't. And for what? A life built on lies and appearances?" Vanessa's defenses crumbled as my words sank in. She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, her hands trembling as she clenched her fists. "Nathan," she said finally, her voice breaking, "I didn't mean for it to get this far. I felt like I wasn't enough. Like we weren't enough." I stood, my movements deliberate, and leaned against the counter, staring down at her. "You weren't enough?" I repeated, my voice low. "Or was it that you thought I wasn't enough?" Her tears spilled over, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "A horrible mistake. I let the silence stretch between us before responding. You're right, Vanessa. You did. And now, you have to live with the consequences. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. I straightened, my expression unreadable. I mean that trust isn't something you can patch up with an apology. You tore it apart the moment you chose Oliver over me, over us. And you did it in front of everyone. She sobbed quietly, covering her face with her hands. But I didn't reach out to comfort her. I wasn't the man she had humiliated anymore. I was someone stronger, someone who understood the power of walking away. Before I left the kitchen, I turned back to her one last time. I hope you're proud of what you've built, Vanessa, because you're the one who has to live in it now. She didn't respond, and I walked out, leaving her to her tears. That evening, I went through the motions of my day, reflecting on how far things had fallen apart. Vanessa thought this was the end, that she had finally hit rock bottom. But she didn't realize that there was still more to come. Because while she was mourning the loss of her fantasy, I was preparing for my next move. And this time, it wouldn't just be words that showed her the truth. It would be action. Vanessa's apologies came in waves after our confrontation. Each one felt more desperate, more hollow than the last. She cried. She begged. She even tried to act like nothing had happened. But none of it moved me. Her world was crumbling, and she knew it. But what Vanessa didn't understand was that I wasn't finished yet. She thought the disaster at Oliver's party was the end of her humiliation. She had no idea it was only the beginning. The first piece of my plan unfolded quietly. I called Maxwell, my trusted assistant, who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes. Everything's in place, he said confidently over the phone. Good, I replied. Make sure it's delivered to the right people. It wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about exposing the truth, not just to Vanessa but to everyone who had laughed at me, who had looked down on me, who had mocked me without understanding who I really was. The fallout began a few days later. Oliver, who had managed to talk his way out of immediate legal trouble after the party, found himself in a much worse situation when his shady business practices were leaked to the press. Maxwell had ensured that the right journalists received all the evidence they needed: fraudulent contracts, embezzlement, and ties to illegal substances. The headlines hit hard. Business mogul Oliver Grant under investigation for fraud and illegal activities. I watched Vanessa's reaction as she scrolled through her phone that morning. Her face turned ashen, her fingers trembling as she read the articles. This can't be happening, she muttered, more to herself than to me. Oh, it's happening, I said, sipping my coffee calmly. Actions have consequences, Vanessa. You should know that better than anyone. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and fear. Did you? I cut her off with a cold smile. Does it matter? Her social circle wasn't spared either. Sophie and her friends, who had been so quick to mock me at the party, found themselves shunned as the truth about Oliver's empire unraveled. The glamorous life they had built around him turned to ashes, and their reputations followed suit. Vanessa tried to reach out to them, but the silence she received in return was deafening. The same people who had laughed at her jokes, who had cheered her on, now wanted nothing to do with her. One evening, as I returned home, I found Vanessa sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I thought I was building something better, she said quietly, her voice hollow. I set my bag down and stood in front of her. You thought you were climbing a ladder, Vanessa, but all you were doing was digging a hole. Her eyes filled with tears. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I didn't think it would end like this. I nodded, my expression unreadable. No one ever does. Despite everything, Vanessa still clung to the hope that she could salvage something. Our marriage, her reputation, anything. She tried to bridge the gap between us with small gestures, like making dinner or leaving handwritten notes on my desk. But it was too late. The woman who had humiliated me in front of her lover and her friends was still the same person, no matter how much she tried to pretend otherwise. The final piece of my plan came into play when I met with a lawyer to finalize the divorce papers. I had been careful, meticulous, and deliberate in how I handled everything. Vanessa wouldn't be left with nothing, but she wouldn't walk away with the life she thought she deserved, either. When I handed her the papers, she stared at them in disbelief. You're divorcing me? she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, I said simply. Because I deserve better. Her tears flowed freely, but I felt nothing. The woman sitting in front of me wasn't the Vanessa I had fallen in love with. That Vanessa had disappeared long ago, replaced by someone who valued appearances over substance, greed over love. As I walked out of the house for the last time, I felt a strange sense of peace. Vanessa's reckoning wasn't just about me. It was about her coming face to face with the consequences of her choices. And as for me, I was ready to leave the wreckage behind and start fresh, stronger and wiser than ever before. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. The silence in the house after I handed Vanessa the divorce papers was deafening. She stared at them like they were a death sentence, her hands trembling as she held the neatly stacked pages. Her once defiant demeanor was gone, replaced by desperation. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice breaking. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms. "I've never been more serious." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head, as if refusing to accept what was right in front of her. "Nathan, I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But this is too much. You can't just throw everything away." I raised an eyebrow. "Throw everything away? Vanessa, you threw it away the moment you decided to humiliate me in front of your lover and your friends. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed the foundation of what we built." Her tears spilled over, but I didn't let them sway me. I had spent too long being the understanding husband, the man who stayed quiet while she pursued a life of vanity and deceit. This was my moment to take control. Over the next few days, Vanessa tried everything. She followed me around the house, pleading for me to reconsider. She cooked meals, left handwritten notes apologizing for what she had done, and even tried to invoke memories of the early days of our marriage. "Remember our first anniversary?" she asked one evening as I sat in the study. "We went to that little cabin by the lake. You said it was the happiest you'd ever been." I didn't look up from the papers I was reading. "I remember," I said flatly, "but that was before you decided I wasn't good enough for you." She flinched at my words, her tears returning. "I was stupid, Nathan. I let my insecurities get the better of me. I was wrong." "You're right," I said, finally meeting her gaze. "You were wrong. But some mistakes can't be undone." She didn't give up, though. Her desperation grew more frantic as the days passed. She even tried reaching out to Sophie and her other friends for support, but they had all distanced themselves after Oliver's downfall. The glamorous circle Vanessa had worked so hard to join had crumbled, leaving her isolated and alone. One evening, she sat across from me at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly together. "Nathan," she said quietly, her voice raw, "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, don't leave me. I can change. I'll do whatever it takes." I sighed, setting down my fork. "Vanessa, this isn't just about forgiveness. It's about trust. And once that's gone, there's no going back." She started to cry again, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. The next day, she made one last attempt to win me over. She dressed in the same outfit she had worn on our first date, cooking my favorite meal and lighting candles in the dining room. When I walked in, I stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. She looked up at me with hopeful eyes, her smile trembling. "I just wanted to remind you of how it used to be," she said softly. I stepped into the room, sitting across from her. For a moment, I let myself remember the Vanessa I had fallen in love with, the woman who had once made me laugh, who had been my partner in everything. But that woman was gone. "This is nice," I said finally, my tone gentle, "but it doesn't change anything." Her face crumpled, and she reached for my hand. "Nathan, please. I can't lose you." I pulled my hand away, standing up. "You already lost me, Vanessa. The moment you chose someone else over me, you lost me." As I walked away, I felt a mixture of emotions: sadness for what we had lost, relief for finally standing up for myself, and a sense of closure. Vanessa had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. For the first time in a long time, I felt free, and I wasn't looking back. The day I walked out of the house for the last time was both the hardest and the most liberating moment of my life. I had spent years building a life with Vanessa, years believing we were partners, equals, and that our love was genuine. But the events of the past months had revealed the cracks that had always been there, hiding beneath the surface. Vanessa had spent weeks trying to salvage what we once had. She pleaded, cried, and apologized more times than I could count. And for a moment, a small part of me wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she could change, that we could go back to how things were. But the truth was, we couldn't. I stood in the living room, the faint echoes of our laughter and arguments lingering in the air. My bags were packed, my decision final. Vanessa sat on the couch, her eyes swollen from crying, watching me with a desperation that cut deep. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. I turned to face her, my expression calm but resolute. "Yes, I do." Tears streamed down her face as she stood, walking over to me. "Nathan, I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll change. Just don't leave." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion, but they couldn't change what I knew to be true. "Vanessa," I said softly, "this isn't just about you. It's about me. I deserve better. And you deserve to figure out who you are without me." I walked to the door, pausing for a moment. "You made your choices, Vanessa, and now I'm making mine." Her sobs followed me as I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. For a moment, I stood there, taking a deep breath. The weight of years of betrayal, heartbreak, and disappointment seemed to lift, leaving behind a strange sense of calm. As I drove away, I reflected on everything that had led to this moment. Vanessa's betrayal, her humiliation, and her desperate attempts to hold onto a life that was already slipping away. It all seemed like a distant memory now. I had spent so long trying to hold things together, trying to be the bigger person, that I had forgotten what it meant to put myself first. This wasn't just about walking away from Vanessa. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my peace, and my life. Over the next few weeks, I began rebuilding. I moved into a new apartment, smaller, quieter, and completely mine. The space was a blank canvas, free of memories and baggage. It felt strange at first, waking up in an unfamiliar bed, making coffee in a kitchen that wasn't ours. But it also felt right. I threw myself into work, focusing on the projects that had once brought me so much pride. Maxwell, ever loyal, ensured that the transition was smooth. "You look different," he said one afternoon as we reviewed a proposal. "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Lighter," he replied with a small smile. "Like a man who's finally free." I nodded, realizing he was right. Vanessa tried reaching out a few times, her texts ranging from apologetic to angry. I read each one but never responded. She needed to find her own way forward, just as I had. One day, I received a letter from her in the mail. It was long and heartfelt, filled with reflections on what she had done and the life we had shared. She wrote about her regrets, her pain, and her hope that I could someday forgive her. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness would come, in time, but reconciliation was off the table. Months later, I found myself at a quiet cafe, sipping coffee and reading a book. A woman at the next table caught my eye, Elena, someone I had met briefly at a business conference years ago. She smiled, and I found myself smiling back. We struck up a conversation, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something new. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was simple, easy, and genuine. Walking away from Vanessa had been painful, but it was the right decision. It wasn't just about leaving her. It was about choosing myself. I had been humiliated, betrayed, and broken, but I wasn't bitter. I was stronger, wiser, and ready for the next chapter. And as I walked out of that cafe with Elena, I knew that the best part of my story was still ahead of me.